In this video, I'd like to look at symbolism. What do money and what do the tithe symbolise? Well, money, as I'd like to show you, implies human self-reliance. It's when we trust in ourselves and our own abilities rather than in God. I'd like to show you that the symbolism that the Bible brings out about money is that if you're rich, it'll bring you into slavery. You won't trust in God, you'll be trusting in yourself, in your own ability. It will then lead you into sin, and finally it will lead you to spiritual death. Now in Genesis chapter 12, Abram, this was before he got the H in his name. God took the H sound from his own name, Yahweh, and he put it into Abram's name. So Abram became Abraham, with the H sound from Yahweh. And Sarai became Sarah, again with the H sound from Yahweh. Abram deceived Pharaoh because he didn't admit to Pharaoh that Sarai was his wife. At Genesis 13 verse 2 we read that Abraham was rich. Genesis chapter 17 verse 13 we read of slaves being bought with money. The third mention of money in Genesis is Genesis chapter 20 verse 16, where we read that after deceiving Abimelech in a similar manner to the way that he deceived Pharaoh, Abimelech then paid Abraham 1,000 pieces of silver. And by the way, those people who believe in tithing, Abraham didn't pay any tithe on these 1,000 pieces of silver. We don't read anywhere that he kept 900 but tithed 100 to somebody else. So this was in response to Abraham's sin. So do you see the pattern? Abraham was rich, 13:2. The implication is that money will bring you into slavery, Genesis 17:13. Money will lead to sin, Genesis 20:16. And finally, Genesis 23:16, the third mention of money, which by the way is the word kesef, silver in Hebrew. We find that he bought a burial cave. Now you put dead people in a burial cave. Okay? Or at least we hope you put dead people in a burial cave. So the first four mentions of money tell us that if you're rich, it will bring you into slavery, it will cause you to sin, and it will lead obviously to your spiritual death. I'm not saying that this was literally true with Abraham, but these four mentions of kesef, silver, money, in the Hebrew Bible, show us God's opinion of money, that money implies human self-reliance rather than reliance upon God. Now, in contrast to this, the tithe, the word tithe means a tenth, it's always food. Leviticus 27:30. Let me read this verse to you. All the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, it is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. So we have a clear commandment here that the tithe is food, it's not money. Also notice that we read of the tithe that it is holy to the Lord. Yes, there is an instance of tithing in Genesis 14. These were pagan items. It probably might have included some items of money, pagan idols, clothing, expensive clothing for women, maybe swords. But it would have been lightweight item in Genesis 14 that Kedorlaomer, I hope I've pronounced that name correctly, was taking approximately 1,000 miles in the direction back home to Babylon. So these were pagan items. This is why the word holy is used in Leviticus 27:30. God's tithe is holy. It's food and it's holy. The tithe before that, which was the goods of the king of Sodom, and we read about Sodom in Genesis 19, we find out they were very wicked, evil people. They practiced homosexuality and they did many other things. God's not approving of that. So that tithe wasn't holy. It's one reason why Abraham decided not to keep any of it, but to give all of it away. With regard to food, food is something that God provides, because essentially it's God who makes plants grow, not us. We can melt gold and smelt it and then forge it into coins and make it into coins. But we can't physically make the sun shine. We can't physically make the rain fall from the clouds. It's God who gives us food. So the tithe here in Leviticus 27:30, it implies reliance upon God. So can you see the contrast with money? Money implies human self-reliance. The tithe implies reliance upon God. You can give money, but don't you dare tithe money, because money implies human self-reliance, and the tithe was clearly implying a reliance upon God, because food gives us life. If we don't have food, we die. And so God chose food items, not just plants but animals as well, for the tithe, because it sustains our life, and without this food we would die. Now, the festival tithe, because there were 3 tithes, so if you wish to pay a tithe today, you can't simply give a tenth, you have to pay several tithes. There was a Levitical tithe, there was a festival tithe, and there was a poor tithe. 3 tithes of a tenth each. No church that practices or claims to practice tithing today demands 3 tithes. And also, they tithed in what was called the Shemitah cycle. They had a 7-year cycle, and every 7th year there was no tithe payable. The land was fallow, so no tithe was payable. Do you know of any church today that believes in tithing, that says we only collect a tithe for the first 6 years of a 7-year cycle, and on the 7th year we collect nothing? Well, let me go back to the festival tithe, which is one of these 3 tithes. The festival tithe was eaten outside the city wall, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 17. The significance of this is that Golgotha, where Christ was crucified, was outside the city walls of Jerusalem. We read this at John 19, verse 20. It says that it was near the city, meaning, therefore, it's outside the city walls. I'm sure you're also aware that in the book of Revelation, Christ is referred to several times as the first and the last. I won't go into this and quote the verses because I don't have time. So, first and the last would be Christ. And the first and the last letters of the Greek alphabet, Alpha and Omega, are also applied to Christ. Christ is called the first and the last, and the Alpha and the Omega. Now, interestingly enough, when we read of the tithe, there are certain prepositional phrases in Hebrew which use the first and the last letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The first Hebrew letter is Aleph. The last Hebrew letter in their alphabet is Tau. So Aleph and Tau are used together, but they aren't translated for some strange reason. They're just kind of there, and they're untranslated in several passages of the Hebrew text. So I'm not saying this for certain. I don't speak Hebrew. I'm not a Hebrew scholar. But because I read Aleph Tau in the Hebrew text at Malachi 3:10 and Deuteronomy 14:22, I put it to you that it might be possible that this implies that Christ is the fulfillment of the tithe. We certainly read of Christ in John chapter 6, where he said, "I am the bread from heaven." Now, why did Christ say, "I am the bread from heaven"? Well, the answer is quite easy. John 6:58. "This is the true bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. He who eats this bread will live forever." Well, he's talking about himself. He's saying that he, Jesus Christ, is the fulfillment of the tithe. Now, my time is limited, so I'm going to go on very briefly to mention Jacob. Jacob in Genesis chapter 28, verse 20, made a very rash promise to God that if God would bless him with food and clothing, then he would pay a tithe. And obviously, we have no mention of Jacob ever paying a tithe in the Bible. Who, for instance, would he pay the tithe to? So it's highly likely that he simply forgot all about this. But God didn't forget about this, because I would suggest that this was fulfilled in Joseph. Now, if we go to Genesis 45, verse 22, we have a very strange statement that's always puzzled me, and I never quite understood this until recently. You know the story. Joseph, the son of Jacob, was sold by his brothers into slavery. He went down into Egypt. There was a famine. And then 10 of his brothers went down into Egypt. Joseph put the cup, the silver cup, in one of his brothers' sacks. And then the 10 brothers had to come down. The 10 brothers were sent back to their father Jacob, but the 10 brothers came back down again. When Joseph revealed himself, it says in Genesis 45:22, he gave to all of them, to each man, changes of garments, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. And of course he also gave them food on both occasions. So they got food, but here in Genesis 45:22 they got clothing, and that's significant, because food and clothing was what Jacob had originally prayed for at Genesis 28:20. It says that 10 brothers went down to Egypt in Genesis 42:3, and yet one of those 10 brothers, Judah, begged that he would be taken after the silver cup was apparently stolen. This was Genesis 44, chapter 44, verse 18. Judah prayed that he would be taken as surety for the lad. So we find that Judah became the tithe. Judah became the tithe. See, God hadn't forgot about that promise. Jacob had. But God hadn't forgotten about the promise of Genesis 28:20. So Judah begged that he would be taken as the tithe. And of course we know that Christ is of the tribe of Judah in Hebrews chapter 7. So again we can see that this points to Christ. The tithe again points to Christ. Now finally, locusts. I'm going to deal with this very briefly. Locusts are mentioned in Joel chapter 1 verse 4. The phrase is difficult to translate, but it probably does mean locust. What are the chewing locusts? What the chewing locust left? What the swarming locust has eaten, what the swarming locust left, what the crawling locust has eaten, and what the crawling locust has left, what the consuming locust has eaten. So we read about these wicked locusts. They basically ruin the land. We read about this in the next few verses. And then we read in Joel chapter 2 of Joel's army. No, Joel's army isn't a great blessing. Joel's army is this army of locusts who are coming to devour the land, to eat up all the crops, as God's punishment for the people's sin. Now, the devourer is mentioned at Malachi chapter 3. Of course, everyone's heard of Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, the great tithing verse that everyone mentions. Even though it says that there may be food in my house, you see they had food in the storehouse, not money. They weren't tithing money, they were tithing food. But we read of the devourer in Malachi chapter 3, verse 11. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes. The devourer here is the locust. And the significance of this is that if the people repent, God is not going to bring this calamity upon the land. Okay? The locust won't be coming to devour the crops if the people repent. But if you read Mark chapter 1 verse 6, it mentions John the Baptist. And what did John the Baptist eat? He ate locusts and wild honey. In other words, Christ, the one who prepares the way for Christ, will eat the very devourers, Joel's army, these locusts of Joel's army.